Welcome to session number 56 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. So this is a now online entirely series that began in 2016, originally as a face-to-face recorded series, focusing on all sorts of authors and their narrative worlds in speculative fiction. So everything from fantasy through sci-fi with detours in horror and new weird and alternate history and even some nonsense stuff as well along the way. Just so long as it was speculative fiction, just so long as there was a narrative world that could be explored with some coherent themes. And we started out originally, as I just mentioned, in face-to-face meetings at the Brookfield Public Library. Due to COVID, we went completely online after a hiatus of several months, and that is what we've been doing now. I talk for roughly 90 minutes about the author, their biography, the works, some of the key philosophical themes or ideas, and we never, by the way, get through enough of that. And then after that, we have a live session through video conferencing for people who want to dig in deeper. We do this generally every month unless I get too busy. And this month is a really special treat. Officially, we're looking at this book with a cover that the author would be rolling in his grave over, as we'll talk about in a moment. Solaris, by the great speculative fiction author, sci-fi author, self-identified, Stanislaw Lem from Poland, one of the great writers east of the Iron Curtain, and who made some really significant contributions, not just through writing science fiction, but through his commentary about it, and also other ways as well. You can call him a futurist. He turns out to have been a futurist who made some pretty good predictions as opposed to some of the others, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Now, the reason why we picked Stanislaw Lem for this time is because the Polish government actually has declared this the year of Stanislaw Lem. And there's a very important anniversary this month of September 2021 as well. So I thought, people have been asking me to do Lem for a very long time. We should definitely get him in here, and we planned for that to be the case at the beginning of 2021. So here we finally are looking at Lem. And I'm actually going to give you a little bit of backstory before we jump into the presentation per se. I wanted it to be about some sort of coherent set of stories. So originally, I was looking at the set of stories that are centered around this spaceman character who's kind of a screw up in some ways, Ijan Tiki, and there's quite a few books out there in which he features centrally. But what I discovered is, unfortunately, in this area, there's not an awful lot of Lem in the libraries, with the exception of a few novels like Solaris. So the short stories that were in these, like in the Futurological Congress, any of those things, I've been reading them and listening to them over this last year. I think they're brilliant, they're funny, they show a lot of insight into Lem's ideas. But they just weren't going to be as easily found for my audience. And I knew that there's like millions of copies of Solaris floating around. It's probably his most famous novel because it's been adapted to film 3 times in ways that Lem himself, at least the Russian adaptations, wasn't into. We'll talk about that in just a bit. And so I thought, well, let's focus on Solaris. But let's also look at some of the other novels in which similar themes are coming up. So if you've got a copy of Solaris, you're golden. But I also want to talk about 2 other novels in particular, one of which is a little bit before Solaris, called Eden, also dealing with the question of making contact with alien races or civilizations, in this case on the planet that they name Eden, and then a later book called His Master's Voice about a project here on Terra, Earth, trying to decipher an alien transmission that they managed to capture, and the failure to do so. There are some really important common themes involved in all of these works. I also am going to be bringing in a few of Lem's own nonfiction, let's call them declarations and conjectures. So one of them is his pretty interesting book, Summa Technologiae, right? Joking off of Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologiae, right? We now live in a technological, not just era, but you could say we have a technological existence. And there are some discussions in this great work of futurology that have to do with the possibility of making contact with alien races. So we're going to look at some of the sections of that. And then, Lem was, as I mentioned, not just a writer, but also a critic. And I think that his criticism helps us to understand his own point of view as an author. So there's this great collection called Microworlds. And in it, not only do we have some discussions about science fiction itself, which are kind of pessimistic, kind of dark and biting. We also have reflections on my life. So when we go into the biography period, I think that will be quite interesting to tap. But he's got, so I'm going to read you some of the titles. Science fiction, a hopeless case with exceptions. One of the exceptions turns out to be Philip K. Dick, who we'll talk about shortly. He's got another piece called Philip K. Dick, A Visionary Among the Charlatans, which tells you what he thought of American science fiction at that time. There's a lot of other cool things in here, but the other one that I want to hit on is Unitas Oppositorum, the prose of Jorge Luis Borges, another author who Lem thought was quite good. So I think by looking at why he thinks they're good and why others are writing, in his view, crap, we can actually learn a lot about Lem himself. The other thing that I thought could be interesting to do, and this is coming from the Stanislaw Lem website, there are these compilations of interviews carried out with Lem. Very helpful to have them all in one place. Some of which are talking about Solaris, some of which are talking about adaptations of that, whether he's a postmodern writer, a philosopher, why he's not been publishing novels at the time that they're interviewing him, just all sorts of really interesting and germane topics that we want to look at. So what we're going to do in this one, since we haven't discussed Lem before, is talk a bit about his biography, which turns out to be quite interesting in many respects. How that fits in with his literary work. One sort of thing to look forward to. Lem doesn't want to be a political writer, but he's writing in political times, so he winds up having to deal with some political, let's call them, implications and repercussions of his work. Then we'll talk about some of his own criticism and what that reveals about his views on science fiction, its value, its progress, its potentialities, its future. And then we'll jump into talking about these three novels, giving primacy of place, of course, to Solaris. And we'll talk about several key philosophical themes that are featuring heavily in Solaris, also winding up in some of the other novels as well. And hopefully we will get this under about 90 minutes or so. So bear with me. There's so much to say about this guy, Stanislaw Lem, that it's hard to pack in there. We might have to return to him in a later session in one of the years to come. With authors that I haven't covered in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series, my custom in the past has been to do a pretty detailed biography and to spend a good bit of time on that, combining the events of their life with the works of the author and talking about that. But I think I'm actually going to do something a little bit more quick and scenic, we could say, if we're thinking about roads, in order to get to the philosophical themes, because I do want to have enough time. Our interest in Lem, I mean, he had a very interesting life, but our interest in Lem is in large part motivated by the works that he produces. So what do we know about him? We actually learn quite a bit, again, from this essay, Reflections on My Life, which starts before his life begins, talking about the chance playing a role in his life and his father, Samuel Lem, being taken prisoner by the Russians, returning to Lemberg or Lav, which changed hands a number of times, his native city only after 5 years in the wake of the chaos of the Russian Revolution. So, he's fighting in World War I, gets taken prisoner, Russian Revolution happens. A lot of people don't really know about this, but the Russian Revolution destabilized not just Russia, but you could say a significant portion of Central and Eastern Europe as well, throwing things into a good bit of chaos. And so Lem is born in 1921, and he grows up, in essentially a well-to-do family. He's of Jewish ancestry. That's going to prove important as some of his family dies in the Holocaust. Is raised Roman Catholic, but it doesn't really stick. And he tells us in his little essay, "I was a good student. Some years after the war, I learned from an older man who held some position that when all the IQs of the high school students were tested, it must have been around 1936 or 1937. Mine was over 180, and I was said to have been, in the words of that man, the most intelligent child in southern Poland." Of course, they didn't tell him anything about that, right, at the time. And when World War II was going to start, he says, "During that period, I learned in a very personal, practical way I was no Aryan. I know that my ancestors were Jews, but I knew nothing of the Mosaic faith and, regrettably, nothing of Jewish culture. It was only the Nazi legislation that brought home to me the realization I had Jewish blood in my veins." He talks about his childhood in some interesting ways here. I mean, he talks about finding a bone and a skull, and breaking into his father's bookcases and cabinets. He seems to have, been kind of a naughty guy, right? He also says, "I grew into a bookworm and read everything that fell into my hands, the great national poems, novels, popular science books. I can remember it, looked with keen interest at the male and female genitalia reproduced in my father's anatomy books." And he talks about how pornography reminds him too much of gynecological examinations to be interesting to him. He talks about being an 8-year-old boy and falling in love with a girl. And he says, "May the psychoanalysts make what they will of the feelings of a small boy. I do not comment further on them." And he says, "I not only imagined fantastic kingdoms and domains, but made inventions and mentally created prehistoric animals unheard of in paleontology. For example, I dreamed of an aircraft shaped like a giant concave mirror with a boiler situated in the focus." And I'm going to skip forward a good bit. What we find is that he's a young man growing up in rather chaotic circumstances. He gets the best education that he possibly can at the time, and he winds up essentially being part of, let's call it the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet system, and he runs into problems. Not only from the Nazis, but also from the communists. So a little bit later on, he talks about, here we go, the Lysenko affair. He says, "At the age of 26, I became a junior research assistant for an organization called the Circle for the Science of Science, founded by Cholanowski. To him, I presented my most dearly held works, a theory of brain functions invented by me, and a philosophical treatise. He called both nonsense, but he took me under his tutelage. Thus, now this is very important for Lem's development, thus I was forced to read logic textbooks, scientific methodology, psychology, psychometrics, the history of natural science, and many other things. These books proved so interesting I had to crack them, the English books, dictionary in hand. And he says, for the monthly Life of Science periodical, I compiled surveys of scientific periodicals from the standpoint of the science of science. By doing so, I became involved in the wretched Lysenko affair. For in my survey, I synopsized the controversy between him and the Soviet geneticists in what an official report from the ministry in charge of Polish universities called a tendentious manner. Now, we could say, well, so what, tendentious? Well, that was a code word for not approved, and that is part of what, set him behind. It gets in the way of him doing some of the work that he'd like to do, and he's considered rather suspect, as we mentioned in other places. He's not on the side of the authorities, right? And so, following up with the Lysenko affair, right, he says, I held Lysenko's doctrine of the inheritance of acquired characteristics to be ridiculous, and I was proved right after several years, but my taking this position had rather painful consequences for our monthly. And, he goes on, tells us how his father dies in 1954. By then, he's, writing quite a bit. At the end of the 50s, I was able to acquire for us, myself and my wife, a small house on the southern outskirts of Krakow, which we still have. And he goes on and talks about, reading science fiction and writing his own science fiction. What else do we need to mention? From 1946 onward, he is writing these novels, ones that he'll say he's not very happy with and sometimes even ashamed of them. And then he's going to, because of the fact that Joseph Stalin dies, there's an opening that takes place culturally, you could say, within not just Russia or the the USSR, but also Poland as well. And Lem takes advantage of this significant freedom of speech to start publishing all sorts of stuff. He goes on and will write a number of novels, short stories, nonfiction as well. And so we should turn to that for a moment. And I do want to bring up something that's really quite funny. There's an article about Lem in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the author of which, William Hoche, says the following. And I think, this is a good sign of how Westerners often get Lem wrong. Lem's renown rests primarily on three works. Solaris, a deeply philosophical work about contact with an utterly alien intelligence. He goes on to talk about the adaptations. His Master's Voice, another classic of traditional science fiction themes. And then finally, Lem's third great book is the Cyberiad, subtitled Fables for the Cybernetic Age. Read on one level, it's a collection of comic tales about two intelligent robots who travel around the galaxy solving engineering problems. A deeper reading reveals a wealth of profound insights into the human condition. And I think perhaps as Lem's work was getting known in the West, that might have been true. But I think now he's better known, right? So I'm going to he's writing stuff from 1946 onward, and by the 1950s, he's starting to get very serious about the work that he's doing, right? So we have, on the one hand, the silly, satirical, dark comedies connected with these heroes like, Ijan Tiki, right? That we'll find as the Star Diaries, Memoirs of a Space Traveler. And then we have other things. The Investigation, a philosophical mystery novel in which a person who's involved doesn't even know which agency they're working for. And then we have Eden. This is a very interesting book, What we have here is a crash landing by a spaceship on Eden, a planet that has sentient life on it, and they're trying to figure out they're trying to fix their ship for one thing, and then they're trying to figure out what is the deal with the life here. And they do all sorts of things and never really get to the bottom of the civilization that has developed and laid down factories and artifacts and all sorts of other things that still has living representatives in this field. So that's sort of a precursor of not being able to really figure out what the hell these creatures are doing. After that, we have more, tales of Perks the pilot, and then we have Solaris, 1961. This is quite a landmark and quite important. But then we have quite a few other stories coming about as well. Memoirs found in a bathtub, The Invincible that Lem himself talks about as part of that period. The Siberiad, very important, right? But also we have his master's voice, the Futurological Congress, another set of Ijantiki stories. And then we start getting to these things like A Perfect Vacuum, collection of book reviews of non-existent books, rather Borgesian, you could say, that is connected to Jorge Luis Borges. There's more Perks the Pilot stories coming out. And then we have Qatar, which is translated as The Chain of Chance. And, the stories keep going and going and going. We also have a lot of nonfiction as well. Dialogues, Going into Orbit, the Summa Technologiae coming out in 1964, Philosophy of Chance, some other things that find their way into Microworlds, and he even writes an autobiography of his childhood before World War II called High Castle, A Remembrance. And so, we see Lem continually writing, straying around quite a bit, continuing his scientific, we could call them, staying abreast of the field, and making his way through literary fields. Lem becomes quite famous. His stuff starts getting translated. Obviously, there's film, and not just film, but also opera and stage renditions of some of his works as well. And he's able to move around a bit when martial law is declared in Poland. Those who remember the Solidarity movement and all the Cold War stuff that was going on. He moves to Berlin, becomes a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study, settles in Vienna by the time that the translation of these are coming out. He's listed as, being in Vienna, and then eventually is going to make his way back to Poland. And he was around for quite a long time, but he stopped writing novels and short stories at a certain point and just focused on all the other things that he wanted to do. We could talk about, as he does, a third phase of his work. He dies aged 84, March 2006, so about 15 years ago, after battling heart disease, and leaves behind a massive legacy. One of the interesting parts of this is that Lem, in his stories, in his speculations, manages to predict or think out ahead of time things like the internet. And he talks a good bit about the internet at points. And he's got a website that was developed, and you can find a lot of resources there. And so he lives on a bit, certainly past 2006, not only in our reading of him, but online. Let's talk about Lem's own relation to his craft and the genre that people would like to, in his view, pigeonhole him in, science fiction, which he is going to say is not just one thing. It's kind of a mishmash of a lot of different things, and it performs different functions. So I'm going to refer quite a bit to his interviews, and I do want to begin by looking at a postscript on his interviews. This comes from his site, so he's looking at these interviews and then saying something about them. But then we'll also bring in his own reflections on science fiction, who's good, who's bad, why that's the case, and about his own writing and place in it. So I want to begin here with this postscript. And he says, quite a lot of these questions, like many of the ones I've been receiving for the past 30 years, are based on a tacit assumption on the part of the writers. And here it is, and this is quite insightful, that my knowledge and understanding of my text problematic, or how they came to be, or where they belong in the scheme of things, is better than the corresponding notions of my interlocutors. In fact, that it is definitive. I'm the author, so therefore I get to say where it fits in. And Lem is saying something, quite humble, but also very realistic. He's saying, well, I've got my own ideas on this, but I'm only one person out of so many, and it's up to you to read the works and figure out what you think they are and what to make of them. And so he says, in reality, while I do have some knowledge, it is not the sort of knowledge that a press correspondent possesses when relating the course of a game, but rather the knowledge of an observer at a printer who sees the newspapers as they're being printed up. My answers may lead to entirely false conclusions. Say that before writing anything, I had spent time considering its problematic. Say that before writing Solaris, I intended to write about the futile attempts of human contact with an alien phenomenon, attempts that end in a spectacular crash of anthropocentrism after the depiction of many adventures and sufferings of the protagonists. That is indeed a good summary of the plot of Solaris, is it not? As well as of Eden, as well as of, not with space travel, but with, all sorts of other excursions, his master's voice, right? So these three books, and so many others of Lem, are centered around that idea. Is that how Lem started writing these things? He says, that was not the case. I didn't know anything at first. Not even that I would put some eerie ocean on that planet. When I write, the process of writing has nothing in common with the building a house, a bottom-up activity based on a top-down design involving architects, investors, builders, and workers. Both the structure of the plot and the adventures of the characters come into being as I write. The initial state of the book is but a nebulous, extremely loose bunch of ideas. The final state, after the writing done, is still a nebulous, rather loose bunch of ideas, albeit markedly less nebulous and less loose. Nevertheless, this uncertainty never totally shrinks away. For example, even then, I have no clue as to the worth of the new work. I don't know how it will be read and understood by its various readers, whether they will be bored or thrilled. Usually, all my works are first read by my wife, and very often I've gone along with her highly critical remarks. It has also often happened that I would not agree with her. For example, when she considered my descriptions of the library in Solaris as spurious. In other works, occasionally I've had an inner certitude that the text had to remain in its initial form. I cannot explain that feeling and whence it comes. And then he says, what may be even more surprising, if not downright paradoxical sounding, this was the way in which I wrote my discursive prose as well. No projects, no blueprints. If an a priori plan was needed, it often turned out they weren't kept. It was as though I was carried away by the current of my thought as I was writing the text, the sort of thing that happens to whitewater rafters, keeping the course, not really managing to do so. Basically, I wrote by trial and error. Here we go. I wrote by trial and error, and since I never cross out anything, instead of throwing away in its entirety what does not please me, I see myself as a high jumper, making attempts at a height, one after another, each one a contained procedure, including the initial run. I usually write both horizontally and vertically. That is, the initial linear plot picks up new ideas, thus widening. Then I have to make over entire chapters or more. Often, when I'm having trouble striking the right tone or keeping the style I want, I start randomly, aware that in the final tally I can get rid of the beginning altogether or replace it with some other. He says, eventually, I learned a lot from myself. For example, I have on occasion inadvertently included a reflexive microcosm within a work. As for the fantastic technological or scientific ideas, the ones I regard as unrealizable have found their place in my grotesque, satiric, and humorous writings. So this is a very important point. A lot of those are the, even Ijan Tiki things, right? And he goes on and says, on the other hand, novels such as Solaris, Eden, The Invincible, Fiasco, Qatar, and the serious ones contain none. I've avoided, like the plague, the problematic of time travel, travel with infinite speed, ESP, psychokinesis, for the simple reason I don't believe they can really come about. Similarly, flying saucers show up exclusively in my satire. The last thing I'll read from this is he says, I consider the exercise of taxonomizing classifications, genealogies, and literature to be a harmful brand of scholastic activity if it is meant to tell us how to pigeonhole work, because the most interesting issues happen to be located on the borders of classes, especially the ones we consider sterile. That is, it may appear that certain literary species are not to be crossbred, but I benefited greatly from such crossbreeding. I hybridized cybernetics and quantum mechanics, impregnating them with fairy tale schemes. I mixed kitchen scripts with rocket tales and Tiki's adventures. I have yet to come across a sci-fi account of an astronaut with a stomach ache or the specter of a stuffed-up toilet, which, as we know, is a major problem of the space shuttle. So this tells us quite a bit, his reflection on Lem's own part about what is going on in his work, what is going on in his writing processes, and what is supposed to be happening with his fiction. Let's go on and look at a few other things in these interviews that I think could be quite interesting. Then we'll talk about science fiction more broadly. So here's something that was asked of him. A German encyclopedia calls you a philosopher. Are you a philosopher? What is your opinion about the presence of philosophy in your novels? And he says, I consider it worthy to uncover what is hidden, even though I am aware of the high risk and the inevitability of simplifications, mistakes, and occasional nonsense. The reason for many of my worries, disappointments, and bewilderments that have not ceased yet is the fact that many people consider, it's very important, philosophizing to be a boring and idle pursuit. Well, one has to be fascinated and make a personal use of it. Philosophizing should be a matter of strong passion. Those who do not feel this passion will certainly feel disappointed by some of my works. So he's saying, I'm going to philosophize. I don't have to be a philosopher in an academic sense. I've certainly studied enough philosophy. And if you don't get into that, if you don't have that penchant, well, that's too bad for you. You're not going to have too much of it. Let's go on to another thing that he has to say. I'm going to come back to that one. So this is in an interview with Istvan Cesare-Rane. You are highly regarded as a writer of both fiction and experimental philosophy of science. You use fictional elements in your philosophical works and philosophical essayist elements in your fictions. What distinguishes these two modes for you? Why don't you specialize in one or the other? And Lem has quite a lengthy answer to this. I'm going to read it off. In all my books, both the belletristic and the discursive in nature, all of them were written spontaneously, that is, choosing the mode of expression that seemed most appropriate to me because it made me write. Aside from essays, I also wrote 3 discursive books, Summa Technologiae, Dialogues in Science Fiction and Futurology. I forgot about the 4th one, The Philosophy of Chance. And there's nothing fantastic about them, because when beginning to write each of these books, I neither had a plan nor any kind of knowledge of their content, and they basically got written unaffected by any genealogical or taxonomic considerations. That is, I did not spend any time thinking about the questions of what genre they are meant to belong to. These books contain a lot of speculation, and I'm aware of it. This speculation could be termed sui generis fantasizing on the themes of future development, technology, literature, for example, but I was merely expressing my convictions, not intentionally setting up hypotheses. In this sense, I functioned as an unwitting futurologist before the futurological gold rush itself took place, and an unwitting philosopher too. Isn't that an interesting way to talk about it? He stumbles into these areas, engaging in a kind of fantasizing, but one that's still connected to technological and scientific realities. He says, I suppose my inclination towards armchair philosophizing was induced by my acquaintance with certain people who edited a philosophical journal. For example, Helen Eilstein and Leszek Kolakowski. Be that as it may, I never had this urge to speak my piece to the world at large as far as philosophy goes. Perhaps this disinclination comes from my conviction, this is a great line here, that the time of crafting seamless, unified philosophical systems is long past. This is so, I claim, because the results of the new hard sciences, led by physics, begin to exceed the abilities of reasoning. That's a really important point there. Our previous understanding of science has been, we come out of, in the Renaissance, and then in the modern period of this era of darkness and dogma, and we know that history is all BS, right? There's much more going on there, and there was a lot of furthering of what became modern science on the part of churchmen. But this idea was that science grows by this cumulative process. It's got a method where you come up with hypotheses and test them, and there's empiricism, and we get to look at how things actually are, and we build and build and build and build and build. And we do so through what? Rationality, the human capacity for reason. Lem, who's on top of the science of his time and following along with it, says, the new hard sciences begin to exceed the abilities of reasoning. The various events and descriptions of states which fly in the face of visual perception, as well as any other human sense or intuition, all that stuff conjured by the human mind. Yet the sober science marches on, registering the smells and colors of quarks, all the while discarding the help we naturally owe to our bodily sensorium and lifelong personal experience. Thus, if the scientific results exceed the horizons of human intellectual comprehension, then human philosophy must be left behind, limiting itself to reflection on the way the world is thoroughly known to us as a niche for certain thinking species, or to considerations of the human position in this world, its correctness and dangers. But as science evolves even faster, negating its prior solutions and pronouncements, it's futile to attempt to create a philosophical system once and for all in harmony with the effects of empirical discovery. Issues such as these are what I packed into my discursive works because I was constantly fascinated and haunted by them. And I saw no way of including them in my belletristic endeavors. The fact that I did not choose one or the other, I alternated between writing discursively and writing belletristically, basically stems from my human nature, that of being like baking dough. My interests grow every which way at once. I would hate to give up using these various strategies of relating the themes of my life. And I do want to point out that in his master's voice contains a number of interesting points where the main character, who is a mathematician involved in this very important scientific process, scientific project to decipher a message, has a few things to say about philosophy along the way, and its capacity to help us understand things. I'm trying to track down some of those that I've dog-eared. Here's a great example. He says, given that our civilization is unable to assimilate well even those concepts that originate in human heads when they appear outside its main current, although the creators of those concepts are, after all, children of the same age, how could we have assumed that we would be capable of understanding a civilization totally unlike ours if it addressed us across the cosmic gulf? The metaphor of an army of tiny little creatures that put to good use their encounter with the corpse of a philosopher still seems to me quite fitting. And he talks about the myth of our cognitive universality, right? And he says, philosophers might assume that they can actually figure all these things out, but they really need to be paying attention to what the sciences reveal to us. And very often what the sciences reveal to us is we don't know what the hell we're doing. We're kind of stabbing around in the dark and, hopefully bringing to bear our notions that can help illuminate things. And that's about as good as it gets. There's a few other things that I do want to bring up. Talking about critics and criticism, we find out that here we go. How do you deal with critics? What sort of critique do you prefer for contemporary novels? And he says, my experiences with Western critics are bad because of many misunderstandings and misconceptions. This changed only after good critics started to deal with my works, those in the highest domain of my fields. Previously, critics read my works as if they tried to find a recipe for donuts in a telephone book. Hence, they were dissatisfied and rejected my books. Now, here's where he says something really interesting. I was aware polemics and discussion are simply futile. How would that look like? It is not true, as critic X says, that my book is dedicated to the matter Y. It is dedicated to the matter Z. These are simply grand misunderstandings. Currently, one can observe the same situation in reverse. In a number of reviews which follow each of my books, just like a tail follows a comet, one can read trite praise, which means that the given critic is convinced he has to do with a, quote, good and praiseworthy product. However, he's not really sure what the book is really about. There are about a dozen critics in the entire world who are both experts in the field of critique and modern science. Without knowledge of science, one cannot comment on my works. How is an ignoramus to know whether the presented concept is my idea, an extrapolation, or final conclusions from the actual scientifically established facts? You notice it's important for him that science fiction has the science side, right? Although one writes for the readers, one would like the critic to be a genius who puts his thermometer into a given text and reads the exact temperature. However, this was not the case. In the West, there's nothing more scary than a novel with an intellectual content. So, isn't that a great one-liner there that he's bringing up? I think that's quite awesome, right? A little bit later in the set of interviews, he talks about, again, critics and readers, and he says something quite interesting here. I know more or less how the critics read me, because obviously he can read what the critics are saying. I know nothing about how I'm received by my readers, the ones who do not busy themselves with public critiquing. My roots are at least twofold, in belletristic writing and in hard sciences and philosophy. To account for who influenced me in terms of individual writers is a feat beyond me. I don't know how much I owe to whom. To tell the truth, I never thought about it. I can say, however, that my attitude as a reader to various authors has changed a lot over time. There was a time when I admired Witkiewicz. Now I'm unable to read through his stuff. Its philosophizing irks me now with its pretentiousness. Its Baroque stylizing when describing the spiritual now turns me off. The whole now seems to me the work of a child prodigy, a snotty pupil who managed to get a hold of some lessons before his time and made mincemeat out of it. And here he talks about several other writers. I haven't read Kafka for a long time because there's something in his works I find repugnant. It's as though they contain more misfortune than is proper for a decent author. It's as if Kafka struggled with both some real forces and some that were but his own personal, desperate neuroses, and I despise writer psychopaths. Of Dostoevsky's works, only Crime and Punishment was compelling enough to make me come back to it, although he also talks about The Underground Man later as well. As for the brothers Karamazov and The Possessed, I was unable to read them again. A single pass was entirely sufficient. Why? I don't know. And we go on. He says, I respect Joseph Conrad, preferring his short stories to Lord Jim and Nostromo. I am overall not a studious reader of belletristic literature. I can't say why. I used to love Baudelaire, Diderot, and Swift. Lately, I tend to return to well-known poetry instead. He brings up Slowacki, Lyman, and Rainer Maria Rilke. So this is some quite interesting remarks that he's making on these topics. We should turn now to what he has to say about science fiction. And I'm going to bring up something from Summa Technologiae. I almost said Theologiae, right? He's talking about science fiction and its part in helping us think about, is there other life in the universe? And he says, the idea of starting a new chapter in our investigations, one extended to the whole of the universe, is appealing as well as dangerous. What distinguishes us from lower beings, that is animals, is not only our civilization, but also an awareness of our own limitations, the greatest of which is mortality. We have no idea in what way beings higher than us exceed us. In any case, we must emphasize what interests us are facts and their interpretation in accordance with the scientific principles, not fantasy work. This is why we shall not be taking into account any of those countless futures that have been prophesied for the Earth and for some other celestial bodies by writers who occupy themselves with this rather prolific genre called science fiction. As we know, it is not literature's habit to use scientific methods or apply mathematical and methodological principles or probability theory, not even when it comes to science fiction literature. I'm not saying this to accuse science fiction of betraying the scientific truth, only to emphasize how important it is for us to distance ourselves from any kind of arbitrariness. We shall be drawing on observational material from astrophysics and on the method followed by the scientist, which has very little in common with the artist's method. It is not because the latter would be more inclined to take risks than the former, but only because the scientist's ideal, the complete isolation of what he aims to represent from the world of his own experiences, the purification of the objective facts, conclusions from any subjective emotions, is foreign to the artist. In other words, the closer one gets to being a scientist, the more one silences one's humanity to allow nature to speak, as it were. The more of an artist one becomes, in turn, the more this artist imposes himself on us, with all the greatness and frailty of his unique being. This is a wonderful way of expressing this continuum with the scientist over here, the artist over here, most of the science fiction writers over here as well, and the philosopher somewhere, in this case not saying anything, in between. And Lem bounces back and forth between these. You know, as I read to you earlier, he will introduce things like aliens that we can encounter and have a futurological congress with, but that's for laughs, right? That's joking around. That's over here on this end. That's the belletristic thing that he's been talking about. And then way over on the other end of the spectrum, we would in fact have stories like Solaris or In His Master's Voice or any of these other ones along those lines. We also need to look at what he has to say about science fiction in this wonderful set of essays in Microworlds. So Lem, to put it very bluntly, was not a fan of the science fiction genre because he thought that much of it was quite garbage. He begins in Science Fiction, A Hopeless Case with Exceptions, by talking about Damon Knight's really great book, In Search of Wonder, which is a set of essays of criticism on science fiction. And he says, in science fiction, fandom rumor has it that science fiction is improving every year. If so, why does the average production, the lion's share of new productions, remain so bad? Right? That's an important question. And he says, the important question is, even if science fiction were born in the gutter and lived on trash for years on end, why can't it get rid of the trash for good? And he says, my essay attempts to answer these questions. Therefore, it is a prolegomenon to science fiction ecology, or an introduction to a socioculturally isolated realm of creative work, or a practical guide for survival in the lower realm of literature. So these are some really great, as he says, pompous titles. Right? And what's he saying to justify that? So he starts out by saying, science fiction is a collective phenomenon of a sociocultural nature. it has the following parts. The readers. On the one hand, the mute and passive majority of science fiction consumers. On the other, the active amateur groups that constitute fandom proper. So that's the audience, right? And then the science fiction producers, authors, some of them also critics, and publishers of magazines and works. And he says, science fiction is a very special case because it belongs to two distinct spheres of culture. The lower realm or realm of trivial literature, and the upper realm or realm of mainstream literature. To the lower realm, this is in his time, he says, belong the crime novel, the western, the pseudo-historical novel, the sports novel, and the erotico-sentimental stories about certain locations like doctor-nurse romances, millionaire and the playgirl stories, and so on. So he says, I'd like to spare the reader a detailed description of what I mean by the mainstream. Let me just quote you some authors who inhabit this Olympus: Joyce, Butor, Sartre, Grass, Mailer, Borges, Calvino, and he goes on, including Graham Greene. And he says, it cannot be maintained with universal validity. These authors do not descend to the lower floors occasionally. We know of crime novels by Graham Greene, fantastic novels by Orwell, and other things like that. Some texts by Calvino are even considered science fiction. And he says, I want to propose a practical rule of procedure which will predict with 98% accuracy whether an author will be considered as an inhabitant of the upper or lower floor. If someone starts to write in the mainstream, and the public and critics get to know him by name, or even as a world celebrity, his attempts at science fiction and fantasy are regarded as excursions or side leaps. And that man lives on the upper floor. So the entertainments of Graham Greene are that. And he says, now going back to H.G. Wells' time, there wasn't such a clear-cut border between these two realms of literature. And Wells could move between them. And he talks about trivial literature. Here's some interesting things to think about. He says, the status of trivial literature can be recognized by several attributes. Its works are read only once, just like the cheapest mass products intended just for a single use. So if you're reading crap science fiction, you read it, it was cool, you're not going to go back to it, unless, of course, you're the kind of person who just mindlessly ruminates on things over and over and over again, right? So there's a constant need to churn. He says also, I must remark a reader of trivial literature behaves just like the consumer of mass products. Surely it does not occur to the producer of brooms, cars, or toilet paper to complain of the absence of correspondence fraught with outpourings of the soul that strikes a connection between him and the consumer of his products. Sometimes, however, these consumers happen to write angry letters to the producer to reproach him with the bad quality of the merchandise they bought. This bears a striking similarity to what James Blish describes in the issue at hand, and indeed this author, more than 5 million of whose books have been printed, said that he received only some dozens of letters from readers during his whole life as author. These letters were exclusively fits of temper from people who were hurt in the soft spot of their opinion. It was the quality of the goods that offended them. So that's another sign of trivial literature, right? Third, the market of trivial literature knows only one index of quality, the measure of the sales figures of the books, right? So this is quite important. And he says, if we use this yardstick, Dostoevsky is no match for Agatha Christie. There are many fans of science fiction who've never, ever read a novel by Stapleton or Wells in their lives, and with an easy mind, I can assert the silent majority of readers does not even know Olaf Stapleton by name, right? Blish and Knight agree the public cannot distinguish a good novel from an abominable novel, with the proviso that they're talking only about the readers of the lower realm. Finally, he says, fourth, there are crass and embarrassing differences between the relations that link the authors of the upper and lower realm with publishers. In the upper realm, it's the author who alone determines the style, length, form, and style of the title, length, form, style of his work, and he has the right to do so, guaranteed unequivocally by the letter of his contract. In the lower realm, the publishers appropriate these rights. And this leads to what he's going to talk about in terms of Philip K. Dick as a example of somebody who's writing good science fiction, sometimes. Not all of Dick's work is good science fiction, according to Blish. But who's being forced into these constraints and limitations of the lower world. As a matter of fact, we know that Dick wrote some really wonderful realistic novels like Milton Lumpke Territory, or the Humpty Dumpty one. I'm blanking on the name. Really great stuff, and the publishers would not publish it because he'd been pigeonholed as a sci-fi author. So, skipping ahead, right? He says that there's this big distinction between the upper and lower realm, and people are trying to push their way up into it, but instead they're stuck in this science fiction ghetto. And he says that, quite understandably, a lot of the science fiction stuff is not particularly good and isn't going to make it out of there. And there's really two big issues: literary quality, but also the fact that it's not really science fiction, it's more science fantasy. And the science stuff in there is being used in ways that can't really be supported, right? He brings up the exception, Philip K. Dick, and he says, because of the lack of selection process to struggle against trash and promote real value, the works of Dick are sometimes compared with those of A. Van Vogt. The novels of both authors share common characteristics that, one, they are composed of trashy parts, and two, they're full of contradictory elements. The contradictions include those of an external nature, as when the world depicted in a book runs counter to empirical scientific knowledge, and of an internal nature, as when during the course of a novel the action becomes self-denying, that is, contradicts itself. And he says, such a diagnosis does not automatically invoke a subsequent condemnation. Right? So he's actually willing to reel out some strings, so to speak. And he says, as Knight and Blish have proved, the phantasmagoric acrobatics of Van Vogt do not add up to a meaningful whole. He does not solve the riddles posed. He does not draw conclusions from the things depicted early in his books. He sketches only ephemeral ideas, piling them chaotically on one another. With all that, he does not hypnotize the weary reader, but only lulls him to sleep. This sleep comes from increasing boredom, not fascinating magnetism. Now, isn't that an interesting distinction? What a wonderful way to cut right through it, right? Hypnotism and magnetism induced by the work, soporific, dull, boring stuff, and they can both be produced by the same basic thing, which is contradictions. So he says, Philip K. Dick seems to write in a vein similar to Van Vogt's, although he does not, like Van Vogt, violate grammar and syntax as well as physics. Dick, too, works with trash, yet his novels are structured with more logic. He is accustomed to let action issue from a clearly and precisely built situation. Only later in the course of a novel does decay, perplexing the reader, begin to undermine initial disorder so that the end of the novel becomes a single knot of fantasies. Dreaming and waking are mixed. Reality becomes indistinguishable from hallucination, and the intangible center of Dick's world dissolves into a series of quivering, mocking monstrosities, so that in the end each novel of Dick's mainstream, for Dick has also written second-rate insignificant works, destroys the order of things he erected at the beginning. And he's going to give some examples here. Even if Dick's worlds owe their explosion to a technology or a disease or madness of the space-time manifold at an ever-increasing speed, they multiply their pseudo-realities so that, as in the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, the levels of hallucination and reality which were separate from each other become a space-time labyrinth. But Dick always moves among the typical trash of science fiction in the realm of androids, of the usual prophets, precogs, psi, ESP fields, brain transplants, and hundreds of other similarly scurrilous products and phenomena. Trash is present everywhere in Dick's books from time to time, though in some of his novels he succeeds in executing a master stroke. He has invented an extremely refined tactic. He uses elements of trash, that is, those degenerate molecules that once had a sacramental metaphysical value, so that he leads to a gradual resurrection of the long-extinct metaphysical exotic values. In a way, he makes trash battle against trash. He does not deny it. He does not throw it away, but he builds from it a ladder that leads straight into that horrible heaven, which during this operation ceases to be an orthodox heaven, but does not become an orthodox hell. This is so interesting, right? Because if you look at what Lem is trying to do in his own works, and he's going to talk about Ubik as a really great example of Dick's work, and then a little bit later he's got, P.K. Dick, a visionary among the charlatans, and singles out Ubik again. Lem is not writing quite the way that Dick is. Lem is more on the, let's keep the science, keep things within the realm of scientific possibility. Let's not bring in any of this crazy, too easy stuff, right? And instead, he's willing to say that Dick is onto something. And you could say a similar thing about Borges, who he devotes an entire essay to here as well. Towards the end of the book, and that's well worth looking at. Although I think we're gonna maybe skip over it right now, in part because I want to save plenty of time for talking about philosophical themes. But what we see here is Lem is very suspicious of the science fiction industry, thinking that it's not particularly good stuff in general, and that there's a few exceptions, and those exceptions are going to have two main features to them. They in some way try to engage with actual science and are informed by it, or if they don't do that, they are fitting into the things that really great literature does. But the vast field, as far as he's concerned, is mostly dreck, mostly commercial, regurgitated stuff that isn't really worth reading. So, what do we say about his own works? Does this have any implication for his stuff? He's willing to, as we remarked with these interviews, leave that up to us to figure out as not critics, but readers. Let's turn our attention now to the novel Solaris in particular. And before we look at some of the key philosophical themes that are being developed in there, some of which Lem tells us this is what I was actually doing in this work, let's check out the book as a whole and also look again at some things that he says in interviews and in essays about this work and what he was aiming at in doing it, what kind of writing it is. And so I think that maybe the place to begin is actually with the book itself. We'll come back to the cover of this in just a moment. So what is the narrative universe that Solaris belongs in? It's a universe that on the one side is that of human beings going out to the stars. Solaris has been around and explored for quite some time, generation after generation, enough for there to be a massive library which gets its own chapter in the work, the Solarists, right? And there's some really great descriptions there that we're going to go into when we talk about the notions of libraries. And Solaris itself is a planet out there in space, one of many planets that is being explored, some of which are being exploited by human beings. And there's something there that people think it's definitely life. The question is it intelligent life? And if so, what kind of thoughts does it think? And is it something that we human beings can have a connection or even communication with, this ocean that produces amazing forms within it, generating them out of itself, and also is going to be producing whatever we want to call them, simulacra of people that the researchers on the Solaris station, which is where almost all of the action takes place. The very beginning is like getting to the Solaris station and then there's, setting foot on Solaris itself when the main character is about to leave Kelvin. And in the meantime, the bulk of what's happening is on the station, and it's the interplay between the human beings, these simulacra, and this vast ocean that surrounds the entire planet. So we're going to get into talking a little bit more about this. You could say that the plot of it is essentially, as has often been summarized, the human beings attempt to connect with the ocean and then to deal with what the ocean has generated in response to them. It's an attempt to try to make sense out of things, both theoretically and practically. Now, a lot of people, in Lem's view, took the wrong point of view, took the wrong set of themes from the work. And so here is where we can get to talking about the film adaptations, which we're not going to go into very much. And you'll see why in just a moment. So this particular picture is taken from the more recent American adaptation of it with George Clooney as the star. And Lem was not actually a great fan of what was happening with this movie and with the stories. So there's, here we go. I'm going to come back to this one in a moment. Here's a question that was asked of him. Was Andrei Tarkovsky in touch with you as he was producing the film Solaris? What is your opinion about the films by Andrei Tarkovsky and Steven Soderbergh? Do you agree with the changes with which the directors made in your story? So this is like Lem's pretty much definitive viewpoint on it. He says, Tarkovsky was crazy about the idea of filming Solaris. During those times, he was told by a number of high-ranking members of the Soviet Communist Party, one should not film this book because the work is ideologically flawed, idealistic, subjective, metaphysical. Now, there's a whole other story to be told about that. It's very funny that somebody would say that idealistic about this book, right? I mean, it is subjective and metaphysical. However, he would not listen to them because Tarkovsky was entirely made up of this idealistic metaphysical stuff mixed with a Russian soul. Hence, he was not a good addressee of such warnings. I have serious reservations regarding his film adaptation. Firstly, I would like to see the planet Solaris. Secondly, during one of our arguments, I told Tarkovsky that he never made Solaris, but Crime and Punishment instead. From this film, we gather that this horrible Kelvin guy would lead poor Hari to suicide and later had some remorse about it, while the latter was strengthened by her reappearance in strange and incomprehensible circumstances. So that's part of the book, right? Hari shows up and is one of the simulacra, right? And we know from the book that because of Kelvin's essentially cruelty and indifference to her, she overdoses on medication and kills herself. And so that is something that's there. But then what does Tarkovsky do? What was awful, just awful, the introduction of Kelvin's parents and an aunt. His mother was the worst, since this was a Russian Mat, i.e. Rodina, the Mother Earth. This really angered me a lot. At that point, we were like two horses dragging the same cart in different directions. Now, here's where he says something really important. People's lives that we get to know at the station are no existentialist anecdotes, but grand questions concerning the place of humans in the cosmos. My Kelvin decides to stay at the planet without any hope, while Tarkovsky created a vision with some island and a hut. I'm quite irritated by this image. I cannot stand the emotional gravy in which Tarkovsky submerged my heroes, not to mention the fact that he entirely, this is very important, entirely removed the scientific landscape of the planet and replaced it by a number of eccentricities. I can tell you very little," he goes on, "about Soderbergh's remake. I hear that critics perceive it as derived from Tarkovsky. From the financial point of view, the movie certainly was a spectacular fiasco." So he's not happy with something that the filmmaker is doing, which is leaving out the real philosophy stuff in there and substituting other stuff instead. And that is, that is a significant problem in Lem's view, dealing with this, right? So we'll come back to the other parts in a bit. He also discusses this in another point. So one of the other interviews says, according to Aquinas, the other summologist, right, because we're talking about this book, the Summa Technologiae, amor est agis cognitive quam cognitido, right? So he's talking about love and it being this positive cognitive force. It's a striking characteristic of your work that you don't depict affectional relationships among your protagonists, at least since Solaris and Return from the Stars. Some theorists have made persuasive arguments that cognition is inextricably tied to certain kinds of affections, and that the Western tradition of purifying the intellect involves a refusal to give value to emotional relationships in the world. Actually, Solaris might be read as depicting exactly this state of affairs, since the Solaris, as soon as they encounter the alien planet, are suddenly brought face to face with the emotional lives they've repressed. You seem to have left this theme behind, so much so that your Golem dispassionately dismisses love. Is this lack of amour, or love, in your work a conscious strategy? So Lem says, love is a matter of individuals. It is the fulfillment of the human psyche's expectations. An individual is able to feel love only towards a small number of the closest persons, be it erotic love, parental or other, for example, religiously inspired. In my private life, this emotion plays perhaps the main role, but one cannot really love humanity. It is impossible even to get to know all coexisting persons. So put, love of humanity is a pure abstraction, entirely impotent in the face of the world's dramatic problems. This is why making love the subject of the book is tantamount to closing one's eyes to the problems of the world. And because of this alone, it would hinge on being escapist. Of course, these are strictly my private convictions. I don't believe love can save nations or entire societies. That may be why love has taken the back seat in my writing. And it's interesting because when he does talk about Soderbergh later on, he is going to criticize the fact that Soderbergh wanted to emphasize the love relationship, and just like his other, predecessor Tarkovsky, is leaving out important themes. I'm not sure I can find the reference here in it, but I'll summarize it for you. Lem says that what he's done writing this book is create, a vast river, and that Soderbergh chose to explore only certain tributaries, leaving the other stuff out. So what's actually being left out? We could call them some cosmic themes, some philosophical themes. I mean, love is a philosophical theme, obviously, but some philosophical themes that are really quite important for understanding what Lem is trying to do, what he's able to bring out in this work. One part of it is, as he was criticizing, you don't get to see Solaris and the ocean in Tarkovsky's work. And, a good bit of what's happening in here is discussions about the amazing things that are happening in this ocean, these vast projections out of it that are being created, each one, different than the other, and the sort of trying to figure out what they are. There's also important themes about not just love, but the nature of these sentient beings that we're calling simulacra that are generated somehow by the ocean, and who are engaging with these characters, perhaps as a mode of communication or a way of investigating them. That's really an important theme, but there's other super important themes as well that got, unfortunately, left out in the movies, and this is why Lem was not a particular fan. You could say that looking back at his distinction between, like, you know, the really good science fiction and the stuff that's schlock, the movies are becoming schlock in his view. We do learn a bit as well from his reflections on my life about how this particular book and some of the other books fit in with each other. He tells us that in these years, we're talking about the 50s and 60s, I was particularly well informed about the latest developments in the various science. The Krakowian circle function is a kind of clearinghouse for scientific literature coming from the United States and to some degree from Canada, coming to all the Polish universities. From the book parcels I received, I could borrow all the works that stirred my interest, including Wiener's The Human Use of Human Beings. At night, I read everything voraciously so I could pass the books on as soon as possible to the people who were supposed to get them. On the basis of this reading, I wrote those of my novels that I can still, notice this phrase, acknowledge without shame. Eden, Solaris, The Invincible, and so on. They incorporate cognitive problems in fictions that do not oversimplify the world, as did my earliest naive science fiction novels. So this is among books that are not oversimplifying the world, right? A little bit later, he says, my earliest novels, which I acknowledge as my own only with some discomfort, I planned and constructed according to a complete design. I wrote the novels in the Solaris group in a similar manner, which I myself cannot explain. The terminology of birth I've used above may sound inappropriate, but it's somewhat apt. I'm still able to point to passages in Solaris and Return from the Stars where I found myself during the writing process in the position of a reader. Isn't that an interesting thing to say? When Kelvin, the narrator of Solaris, arrives at the station hovering over the planet Solaris and finds it empty of human beings, and when he starts his search for the crew and encounters the scientist Snow, who goes into a state of panic, I had no idea why anybody had expected his arrival or why Snow behaved in this peculiar manner. And indeed, I had no idea at all that some living ocean would cover the whole planet. All this was divulged to me in the same manner that it becomes clear to the reader in the course of reading the book, with the sole difference that it was I who created the novel. He calls the period in which he wrote Solaris his second period, and he says that to create something radically new, it was necessary to advance into another field of possibilities. I believe that in the first period of my career, I wrote purely secondary things. In the second period, Solaris, The Invincible, I reached the borders of a field that was already mapped. In the third period, when I wrote, for example, reviews of non-existent books and forewords to works that, as I put it ironically in an interview, would be published sometime in the future, but that do not exist yet, I left the fields already exploited and broke new ground. So what is happening in terms of Solaris? Well, it's going beyond what he was doing in his earlier works that he would disavow if he could, but it's still remaining within the realm of science fiction, and it's not something like, say, Summa Technologiae, which is going a bit. Well, certainly it's not science fiction. It's a different sort of thing. And, I think if we look at Solaris, especially if we look at the last chapter, which he talks about writing about a year later, he says that he was a prisoner in his nightmares, and Rhea is still there. And then eventually she's going to be gone, right? He says, I do not remember the exact sequence of events after that as I stumbled half naked through the length and breadth of the station. I came to my senses again lying on a metal table, and he asked Snow, where is she? She's not here. But Rhea is dead. She will come back, I whispered. Instead of dreading her return, I wanted it. I did not attempt to remind myself why I myself had once tried to drive her away and why I had been so afraid of her return. And Snow says, no, we've used a machine and she's gone. We've dispelled her. We'll write a report later on. We'll ask for an immediate link with the council. The planet will no longer be subject to the four-power convention. We'll be authorized to use any means at our disposal. And Snow essentially wants to destroy things. And, they talk a bit more. And there's some back and forth discussion with them. Here's the very final bit. I sat by the panoramic window looking at the ocean. There was nothing to do now that the report, which had taken 5 days to compile, was only a pattern of waves in space. It would be months before a similar pattern would leave Earth to create its own line of disturbance in the gravitational field of the galaxy towards the twin suns of Solaris. And he goes on and he says, there were several months to go before I could leave. I could watch the birth of the days, watch the mimoids arising, the different fluid forms that are developing. And he says, what does Earth mean to me? What does that word mean? I thought of the great bustling cities where I would wander and lose myself. I thought of them as I'd thought of the ocean on the second or third night, when I'd wanted to throw myself on the dark waves. I shall immerse myself among men. I'll be silent and attentive, an appreciative companion. There will be many acquaintances, friends, women, perhaps even a wife. For a while, I shall have to make a conscious effort to smile, nod, stand, and perform the thousands of little gestures which constitute life on Earth, and then those gestures will become reflexes again. I will find new interests and occupations. I will not give myself completely to them, as I shall never again give myself completely to anybody or anything. And he goes on a little bit further. They have a very interesting discussion about God that we can look at perhaps later. And then it ends with him taking a helicopter and flying to an island that's within this. And he says, I flew past the island slowly, yard by yard. I descended to the level of the eroded peaks. The mimoid was not large. It measured about 3/4 of a mile from end to end. It was a few hundred yards wide. In some places, it was close to splitting apart. On the scale of Solaris, it was only a tiny splinter, weeks or perhaps months old. I found a beach. And then the rotors almost hit a cliff that reared up suddenly in my path, but I landed safely, cut the motor, and slid back the canopy. Standing on the fuselage, I made sure there was no chance of the flitter sliding into the ocean. The cliff I had almost hit was a huge bony membrane pierced with holes. He goes to that. And then he says, it was like looking at the ruins of an ancient town, a Moroccan city, tens of centuries old, convulsed by an earthquake or some other disaster. So he's moving around the mimoid, the thing that the ocean has brought forth. And it ends by saying, during the last week, I had been behaving so normally, Snow had stopped keeping a watchful eye on me. On the surface, I was calm. In secret, without really admitting it, I was waiting for something. Her return? How could I have been waiting for that? We all know we are material creatures subject to the laws of physiology and physics, and not even the power of our feelings combined can defeat those laws. All we can do is detest them. Right? The age-old faith of lovers and poets in the power of love stronger than death, that finis vitae sed non amoris, is a lie, useless and not even funny. And he goes on and says, that liquid giant had been the death of hundreds of men. The entire human race had tried in vain to establish even the most tenuous link with it, and it bore my weight without noticing me any more than it would notice a speck of dust. I did not believe it could respond to the tragedy of two human beings. Yet its activities did have a purpose. True, I was not absolutely certain, But leaving would mean giving up a chance, perhaps an infinitesimal one, perhaps only imaginary. Must I go on living here then among the objects we had both touched and the air she had breathed? In the name of what? In the hope of her return? I hoped for nothing. And yet I lived in expectation. Since she had gone, that was all that remained. I did not know what achievements, what mockery, even what tortures still awaited me. I knew nothing, and I persisted in the faith that the time of cruel miracles was not past. What a wonderful ending that leaves everything in suspension. We don't know what's going to happen with this ocean world, this vast creature of unknown intelligence. We don't know what Earth is going to do. We don't know if he's really going to go back to Earth or not. And so, this world that has been sketched out for the purposes of this book still remains a largely unexplored and equivocal, though certainly investigated and speculated about environment and entity. There are a number of key philosophical themes that I'd wanted to discuss in length, but this video is already getting a little bit long, so I'm going to collapse them all into one rather far-ranging discussion. And these are themes that are found not just in the novel Solaris, but also in, things like the Summa Technologiae and discussing alien life and whether we'd be able to understand them. The common theme that comes up as well in these two novels, His Master's Voice, Eden, and in other Lemian novels. So what are these big key themes? One I've just mentioned, the impossibility of really establishing contact. It's possible to have first contact, to know that there's something there and that it seems to be intelligent, but to figure out how to connect, to communicate, that's what turns out to be beyond the capacities of human beings and human rationality, as Lem wants to say. And notice that this isn't for failure of trying or applying different ideas. We'll get into that in a moment. Another key thing that comes up in Solaris is these people who are, sentient beings, have characteristics. They're not completely blank slates that are connected with the astronauts who are checking out and trying to understand Solaris after so many generations of research. And again, this has to do with the attempt to make contact. They engage in an unauthorized and novel experiment of more aggressive engagement with this ocean, this sentient ocean. And the ocean sends back in ways that we don't really know, in ways in which the beings themselves don't know, these simulacra of people who are important in the astronauts' lives. And, these are people who are produced on a very different material basis, right? And in some respects, they could be immortal, but they struggle with the same human condition that the rest of us do. What are we? How the hell did we get here? What are we supposed to be doing? All these big, as Lem derided them as existential questions, but they really, and he said they're bigger questions than that. They really are existential questions, and so there aren't any answers provided. A third really important theme, I think, is the development of libraries of speculation, research, pseudoscience, all of these things surrounding the problems that we run into in these stories. And of course, the fourth big theme would be this notion of the sentient ocean, which we'll get to in just a bit. And I actually like to begin by talking about the library thing. And we'll begin with not talking about Solaris itself, but rather the later His Master's Voice. This is in the very first chapter. The Master's Voice project has an enormous literature, more extensive and diverse than ever had the Manhattan Project. Upon its public disclosure, America and the world were inundated with articles, treatises, and essays, so numerous that the bibliography alone is a tremendous tome as thick as an encyclopedia. The official version is the Ballon Report, which the American Library later published in 10 million copies, but the essence of it appears in the 8th volume of the Encyclopedia Americana, and there have been books about the project by others who held high positions in it, such as Rappaport's The First Interstellar Communication, Dill's Inside His Master's Voice, or Prothero's HMV, The Implications for Physics. And he goes on and says, there are too many historical treatises even to mention. In a separate category are books not factual but interpretive, ranging from the philosophical and theological even to the psychiatric. The reading of such publications never fails to weary and annoy me. It is no coincidence, I am sure, that those who have the most to say about the project are the ones who have had no direct contact with it. And later on, he talks about graphomania. And this is quite interesting because the same thing shows up in the literature about Solaris, this planet and its ocean. In that, he says that there's these volumes in the library. There's some summarization of the experiments, and he says, compared with the proliferation of speculative ideas which were triggered off by this problem, medieval scholasticism seemed a model of scientific enlightenment. The second part of this second volume of Hughes and Oegel, nearly 1,500 pages long, was devoted exclusively to the bibliography of the subject. There would not have been enough room for the books themselves in the cabin in which I was sitting. And he summarizes these. I'm not going to try to read too much of this. I'll just hit on a few interesting high notes of it. He says, we have some sort of mathematical hypotheses, underestimating the resources of the human mind, bowing to the unknown, proclaiming the ancient doctrine, arrogantly resurrected of ignoramus et ignorabimus. We don't know and we won't know. Others regarded the mathematicians' hypotheses as sterile and dangerous nonsense, contributing to the creation of modern mythology based on the notion of a giant brain. Yet others, but the would-be experts were legion, and each had their own theory. A comparison of the contact school of thought with other branches of Solaris studies, notice that, Solaris studies, during the last quarter of a century made it clear that a Solaris cybernetician had difficulty in making himself understood to a Solarist symmetriologist. How do you expect me to, communicate with the ocean when you can't understand one another? So, how are they going to understand this phenomenon of the intelligent, to some degree, ocean? And he says, gradually in scientific circles, the Solaris affair came to be regarded as a lost cause, notably among administrators of the Institute, where voices had recently been raised suggesting financial support should be withdrawn and research suspended. No one until then had dared to suggest the final liquidation of the station. And then he goes, many people in the world of science, however, especially among the young, had unconsciously come to regard the affair as a touchstone of individual values. And he goes through all these different hypotheses that the ocean is basically like a yogi, or that it's, all sorts of other interesting things. And nobody knows. Nobody actually understands. But the writing of books has no end. And it's to the degree that nobody could master that literature, even if bibliographies are possible. Now, it's centered on this ocean that we know in the story is doing something. It's thinking something. It's producing something. And there's actually, lots of descriptions of that. Here's one of them. Genius and mediocrity alike are dumbfounded by the teeming diversity of the oceanic formations of Solaris. No man has ever become genuinely conversant with them. Gies was by no means a mediocrity, nor was he a genius. He was a scholarly classifier, the type whose compulsive application to their work utterly divorces them from the pressures of everyday life. He devised a plain, descriptive terminology supplemented by terms of his own invention. Although these were inadequate and sometimes clumsy, it has to be admitted no semantic system is yet available to illustrate the behavior of the ocean. The tree mountains, extensors, fungoids, mismoids, symmetriads, and asymmetriads, vertebrates, and agulus are artificial, linguistically awkward terms, but they do give some impression of Solaris to anyone who has only seen the planet in blurred photographs and incomplete films. So, nobody actually knows what this ocean is doing, or all these different interesting formations, so vast that you can land a helicopter in them and explore them, some of them lasting for weeks on end. Maybe they're an attempt for the ocean to communicate with us. Perhaps it's just something the ocean does to amuse itself. Nobody actually can make sense of this clearly alien life. And so that brings us to the key idea, right? In Solaris, it is essentially the vast cosmic, earthbound ocean that is the alien we cannot make any useful contact with, and we can't understand it, right? So a little bit later in the book, one of the characters says, contact with the ocean, as I see it, the problem is basically very simple. Contact means the exchange of specific knowledge, ideas, or at least of findings, definite facts. But what if no exchange is possible? If an elephant is not a giant microbe, the ocean is not a giant brain. Obviously, there can be various approaches, and the consequence of one of them, so he's talking to his simulacrum, is that you are here now with me, and I'm trying my hardest to make you realize that I love you. Just your being here cancels out the 12 years of my life that went into the study of Solaris, and I want to keep you. And then now he's talking and trying to give her some idea about what's her purpose. You may have been sent to torment me or to make my life happier, or an instrument ignorant of its function, used like a microscope with me on the slide. Possibly you're here as a token of friendship or a subtle punishment or even a joke. It could be all of those at once, or, which is more probable, something else entirely. If you say our future depends on the ocean's intentions, I can't deny it. I can't tell the future any more than you can. I can't even swear that I always will love you. After what has happened, we can expect anything. Suppose tomorrow it turns me into a green jellyfish. It's out of our hands. So not only can the researchers not make effective contact with the ocean, they can't even supply answers to these people that have been created by the ocean about what their point or purpose is. We have a similar problem coming up in Eden, right? A ship crash lands, a ship composed of a number of different experts using robots and things like that. And there is a civilization, or perhaps several civilizations, on Eden, and a number of different kinds of aliens. They appear to be involved in some sort of war or struggle with each other, but they're never able to figure out how to really relate with them. And they do have quite a bit of contact. And one of the characters, the engineer, says, I think we should leave. Everyone looked at him with astonishment. He went on, I felt differently before. It's a question of the price, just the price. Undoubtedly, we could learn much more. But the cost of obtaining that knowledge of these aliens, their civilization, their history, it might be too great for both sides. After what has happened, the possibility of peaceful contact, of coming to an understanding is, it seems to me, extremely remote. Each of us, whether we like it or not, has his own concept of the world, of this world. Mine was that terrible things were going on here and we should intervene. As long as we were Robinson Crusoes going through our wreckage and making repairs, I said nothing. I wanted to wait until I knew more and until we could make use of our machines. But I see now each intervention on behalf of what we hold to be good and right will end the way our last excursion did, with the use of the annihilator, with deadly force, right? We can always justify ourselves, argue self-defense, but instead of helping, we're destroying. If only we had better knowledge, said the chemist. The engineer shook his head. with better knowledge, we'd see each side was right in its own way. And so it's impossible to really understand, to generate an understanding of the condition, the mindsets, the socio-history of these other beings, even though they're much closer to us than a sentient ocean. Finally, we have his master's voice, written later than these works, right? And it's very interesting because what is his master's voice? It is a transmission that at first people were doubtful about, and then they realized, no, this is a regular transmission from the stars, and it's a letter, is how they think about it. But it's a letter without any of the things that we need in order to translate it. And one of the things that they do, and this is where it connects it to the Solaris ocean, one of the things that they do is they say, oh, perhaps this is genetic coding. And they use it to create several compounds which are alive, which do things. They call them frog eggs and Lord of the Flies. Now here's a really interesting summary by the main character, the narrator of his master's voice. And he says that, he's talking to a senator, he says, keep in mind that we've done what lay within our power to do and so imposed our knowledge, perhaps simplified or erroneous notions on the code. McMahon asked how this was possible if it was very much like the breaking of a cipher. And he says, it is possible that the translation was false. If we were to send telegraphically the genotype of a man, and the receiver were able to synthesize on the basis of that only white blood cells, he would end up with amoeba-like things as well as an enormous amount of unused information. One cannot say that he who produces corpuscles, having before him the human genotype, has read the message correctly. The differences on that order? Yes, we made use of 2 to 4% of the entire code, but that is not all, because within that small percent there could be a full third that's guesswork. We put ourselves into the translation from our knowledge of stereochemistry, physics, and so on. If the genotype of man were read to a similarly low degree, one could not even construct white blood cells. At the most, something in the nature of a lifeless protein suspension. I think, incidentally, that conducting precisely such experiments with the human genotype, which has been deciphered to about 70%, would be extremely instructive for us, but we cannot do this because we don't have the time or the resources. And then the senator asks him, what was the difference in development that separated us from the senders of the message? And he says, I don't know. We don't have enough information. There's no way to actually tell. We are looking at crumbs from the table of this higher civilization. And we just simply don't have enough to work on. We can project anything that we want onto these aliens, but that's speculation. That's not really getting at things, and they'll generate a vast literature about this as well. And so this is really an important theme that I think ties things together for much of Lem's works. When we're looking at things that we could say are speculative but more realistic science fiction, his attitude is not only skeptical but pessimistic in this way about the possibility of ever really understanding alien life. When he's doing comedy, when he's doing satire, like, the various spaceman Ejon Tiki stories or Pricks the Pilot, well then, we can understand aliens well enough. They're just as screwed up as we are. But that's not remotely realistic. That's sort of playing around with things. So this is a great way to end talking about this really amazing novel of speculative fiction, not just science fiction, but revealing an awful lot of other stuff to us in the process, even though, like so many Platonic dialogues, it is operatic, meaning that it doesn't lead us to the kind of conclusion that we're looking for. We don't understand the ocean. We don't even understand the human beings that are involved all that well, but we have perhaps learned something on the way.